The village of Eldamir was a quiet place, its people living in the shadow of the forest that bordered their homes. The whispering woods stretched for miles in every direction, its ancient trees towering over the landscape like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The trees had stood there for as long as anyone could remember, older than the village itself. And the stories about the woods had been passed down through generations like whispered warnings. There was something not quite right about the forest, something that sent a chill through the air even on the warmest days. The villagers spoke of strange things, of voices carried on the wind, of figures glimpsed moving between the trees at the edge of sight, and of those who wandered too far into the woods and were never seen again. The elders of the village warned the children never to stray beyond the tree line, and for the most part, the people of Eldamir heeded their advice. But there were always a few who couldn't resist the pull of the forest, who felt the whisper of the trees calling them deeper into the shadows. One such person was Elias, a young man who had grown up in Eldamir, the son of a woodsman who had vanished without a trace when Elias was just a boy. His father had been one of the best-known woodsmen in the village, a man who knew the forest like the back of his hand, who had ventured deeper into the woods than anyone else, and always returned with stories of strange sights and sounds. But one day his father went into the woods and never came back. The search parties had combed the forest for days, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest what had happened. Over time, the villagers had come to accept his disappearance as another unsolved mystery of the Whispering Woods, another victim of whatever strange forces lurked beneath the trees. But Elias had never stopped wondering what had happened to his father. He had grown up with the whispers of the trees in his ears, the wind rustling through the branches, carrying voices that only he could hear. Now, as a man grown, Elias found himself drawn back to the woods, unable to resist the pull of the trees any longer. He stood at the edge of the forest, his heart pounding in his chest, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground, and the forest seemed to come alive as the light faded, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, their branches moving like the arms of 1,000 unseen figures. The whispers began again, soft at first, like the murmur of distant voices, but growing louder with each passing moment until they surrounded him, pressing in from all sides. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. They were calling to him, urging him to step into the darkness, to leave behind the safety of the village and venture into the unknown. Against his better judgment, Elias took a step forward, crossing the invisible line between the village and the forest. The moment he did, the world seemed to shift around him, the air growing colder, the light dimming as though the trees themselves were closing in, blocking out the sky. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and he felt a strange sense of familiarity wash over him, as though he had been here before, though he knew he hadn't. The trees seemed to move with purpose, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, guiding him deeper into the heart of the forest. He walked for what felt like hours, though the sun had barely dipped below the horizon, and soon he lost all sense of time and direction. The path beneath his feet disappeared, swallowed by the undergrowth, and the trees loomed larger, their trunks twisted and blackened, as though they had been scorched by some ancient fire. Suddenly the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. Elias froze, his heart racing, his breath shallow. He was no longer sure where he was, or how far he had wandered from the village. The trees around him were unfamiliar, their branches intertwined in a dense canopy that blocked out the last of the daylight. The forest was unnaturally still, the air heavy with the scent of decay, and Elias could feel the weight of the woods bearing down on him, as though the trees themselves were watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. Then, without warning, the ground beneath his feet shifted, and he stumbled forward, falling to his knees in the dirt. His hands brushed against something cold and hard, and as he cleared away the leaves and debris, he saw that he had uncovered an old stone marker worn smooth by time. It was covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the surface, symbols that Elias couldn't understand, but that seemed familiar all the same. As he stared at the stone, the whispers began again, louder this time, more distinct. He could hear his name being called, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "Elias," the voice whispered, sending a shiver down his spine. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the trees around him, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to be coming from the trees themselves, as though the forest was alive, speaking to him through the rustle of leaves and the creak of branches. "Elias, come closer," the voice urged, and despite the fear gripping his heart, he felt himself being drawn forward, as though some unseen force was pulling him deeper into the woods. As he stepped closer to the stone, the ground trembled beneath his feet, and the trees swayed violently, their branches whipping through the air like the limbs of some great unseen creature. The whispers became a cacophony, filling his mind with 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, their words overlapping and merging into one. He could feel the presence of something vast and ancient stirring beneath the surface, something that had been sleeping for centuries but was now waking up, drawn by his presence. The stone beneath his feet began to glow faintly, pulsing with a soft, eerie light, and the air around him crackled with energy. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath him, and Elias was plunged into darkness. He fell for what felt like an eternity, the whispers growing louder and more frantic as he tumbled through the void. When he finally hit the ground, the air was knocked from his lungs, and for a moment he lay still, gasping for breath. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on him from all sides. As he opened his eyes, he realized that he was no longer in the forest. The trees were gone, replaced by towering stone walls that stretched up into the darkness above. He was in a cavern, deep beneath the earth, and in the center of the chamber stood a massive tree, its roots entwined with the stone, its branches stretching up into the shadows. The tree was ancient, its bark blackened and twisted, its limbs heavy with age. And as Elias stared at it, he realized with a start that the whispers hadn't stopped after all. They were coming from the tree. The branches swayed gently in the still air, and the leaves rustled softly, carrying the voices of the forest with them. "Elias," they whispered again, and as he stepped closer, he felt the ground beneath him tremble once more. In that moment, Elias understood. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hungry. It had been feeding on the souls of those who wandered too far for centuries, drawing them into its depths, never to return. And now it had claimed him as well. The roots of the tree wrapped around his legs, pulling him closer, and as the darkness closed in around him, Elias heard the last of the whispers fade into silence.